My name is Jason Modica. I'm currently the Deputy Mayor of Mildura and I'm running as an independent candidate for the upcoming federal election. I live in Nichols Point, but I just grew up down the road in Golgol. I'll get to the questions in the end, just a bit of history, if that's all right. My grandfather had 2 mail runs. He had a mail run in the 50s from Mildura to Menindee, and he also did the mail run along the Murray from Mildura to Renmark. So a lot of my early stories of the rivers were from a man who didn't work the rivers, but serviced the people along them. I think one of the things that I've found so fascinating is that, sort of tapping into what Jane said, is there's an intimate knowledge of how things work. When you'd get a massive set of storms come in over central Queensland, people would kind of know that 8 weeks later the Darling was going to turn into something very, very special. So not just the Darling, but the Anna Branch and the Frenchman, and that massive delta there that serviced not only the Indigenous people but the colonialists after everything was taken and utilised and worked in a different way. I have really fond memories of camping near Wilcannia in 1977 with the Italian side of my family. There was probably 40 of us in caravans and tents as the Darling River was coming out of flood. And there was cod and perch and catfish. But what was also quite amazing was the size of the blue yabbies. I reckon I was 8. And my dad and uncles had a massive old copper pot that because you could eat until you fell over, really. It was that bountiful. And just reflecting on what it looks like now, which is green water in holes. It hasn't discharged into the Murray properly since they drained the lakes for a pipeline. And we went back to near Louth in 79, similar things, just on the river with family. Not really as a 9 or 10-year-old, you don't really understand that may be the last time you will see something like that. This is in real-time destruction or eco-genocide, as it's been called before. And I'm a little bit angry about it. A lot of things, in a way, it forces you to reconsider, hey, look at the problem. Historic over-allocation. There's only 50,000 people west of Cobar in New South Wales and governments don't care. It's like a bureaucratic nightmare. There's people out there struggling and the New South Wales government just turn their back. And it wouldn't matter what stripe they have. It wouldn't matter if it was Liberal, Labor, Green, National. They just look the other way. On top of that, growing up on the river and on a market garden, with very, very talkative, Italian parents and stuff like that, there's always the myth of Neville Wran, trading water out of the Murrin Bridgie to his brother-in-law, Bob Smith, to Tandau in 1980. And there's an absolute litany of mistakes from then on. So this is historical over-allocation and historical mismanagement. But because of the lack of population and the uniqueness and the remoteness of the area, people continue to look the other way. There's Penny Wong's buying of the Goanna water, I think it was technically called, and plus Barnaby Joyce's Tandau purchase in 2017. This is all heavily documented by the Australia Institute. If you want to look into that, I can pass on the information if you want. For me, things get really exciting when they unbundle the water in 2000. From 1900 to 1999, there was 2 cease-to-flow events, really, on the Darling after World War I and after World War II. And that, I think the hydrographs proved that. The Darling did get low and sometimes it would peter out, but those big storms in central Queensland or northern New South Wales, they'd come through and the river would fill again. And from 2000, with the unbundling of water, the commodification of water, there's been 15 cease-to-flow events from 2000 until now, the longest lasting 520 days. Once again, I'm getting a little bit angry because there is an absolute swathe of information that has suggested that this is happening, and politicians have turned their back, for whatever reason, from looking at that. I agree with Jane 100% in regard to the lack of enforceable regulation. How do you get people who have lots of money and lots of time to ring politicians to actually engage and be a part of a decision that keeps a wonderful, iconic river alive and actually discharging into the Murray? You know, when I was a kid, you could go to the junction and you'd see this amazing, you know, creamy, milky white water, you know, swirling into the grey green. This is after the clear stuff, swirling into the Murray. You know, it was a defined confluence that was kind of cool. You know, it was something living off its own accord and off its own pulse, and that's been gone probably since unbundling. I was lucky enough to do the Australian Conservation Foundation River Fellowship last year and learned a lot about the power of lobbyists in our country, the power of agriculture. And one of the things that became quite apparent is when you look into it deeply is we have two documents that sort of run the river. One's the 2007 Water Act, which technically should guarantee an environmental level of sustainable take, and then you have the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which seems to be a document that will give those with the right words and the right funding a chance to give irrigators their go. I think in the 2007 Water Act, the volume of water needed for a marginally healthy river was about 4,000 gigs a year, and for a very healthy river was 7. But the word on the street is that a lot of people who were big-time lobbyists were saying that needed to be broken down to put a 2 in it, like a New South Wales postcode, and that was brokered away by successful lobbying from people who had vested interests. That's another tough one to live with too, because you realise that a lot of those original studies still have merit and they're still there. When I presented with Council and as an individual to the Royal Commission last year, Brett Walker was quite interesting in saying that when the time comes to tally up whether the river's healthy or not, and I think you just need to look at the Darling to realise it's not, by rights the federal government should be able to take the water back through the 2007 Water Act. But Royal Commissioner Walker said that with the nature of what, and I'm paraphrasing here because I'd never be as eloquent as him, with the power of irrigation lobby and you know, the infiltration into politics, they would probably argue that point and try and stop that water being taken back for the river. Other information that concerns me, this is reflecting on the importance of the Darling as a healthy river for flora and fauna. People have got a very good study suggesting that a lot of the cod and perch that populate the Murray come out of that amazing bit of river between Ellerslie and Wilcannia, and once you remove that, because the Murray is such a highly geared working river, you start losing your ability for those fish that breed in the Darling to travel upstream and downstream on the bigger working river. I'll just have a drink, sorry. One of the other concerns too, sort of mimicking the over-allocation in the Northern Connected Basin with cotton, or maybe in the Murrumbidgee with rice and other crops, is the amount of almonds going in and around Mildura. I think in 1718 there was something like 4,500 hectares of almonds coming into planted in Mildura in 12 months, and 15,500 projected for the next 5 years. So in the year 1718, 45... Yeah, not 1718. I don't know what happened in 1718. 1789 maybe is a different story. And then 15,000 hectares in the next 5 years. Some people are pretty concerned that it may well be easier to get a water licence and an AWL than it is to put up a pergola on your house, which is a massive concern. And there's different ends of that argument. I'm just putting it out there. So for me, we're at a situation where a very unique, wonderfully amazing, supportive river that's been very fruitful for anybody who's lived along it, from the Indigenous people through to the original station owners, has really, in less than 20 years, been made to just be an open channel with total disregard for anyone downstream. I am on the Murray-Darling Association with Jane, and we've done a lot of work on an irrigator's body, and our strategic meeting earlier in the year, I got to the point where we were saying we had to put up our hand and identify a state of origin complex. So we couldn't actually have a say about what's happening in the entirety of the basin without saying which state you come from, because everybody said for time and time again that the Murray-Darling Basin Plan was a great document, was a great piece of legislation. So that was a federal legislation, but then they handed it back to the states to implement it. So this reflects back onto the ombudsman or a regulatory body. And then the states just bickered like they'd done since federation. So there's a hell of a lot to be done. There's still a lot worth fighting for. And I'll just read a couple of the not solutions, but things that I see in a more concise way, because I've rambled on a bit, I reckon, but that's not unusual. So over-allocation, the commodification of water have reduced our rivers and their precious water to tradable commodities. To minimise the potential of repeated fish kills and blue-green algal outbreaks, immediate action needs to be taken to ensure the rivers in the Murray-Darling flow and irrigation towns along them can thrive. We need to restore connectivity to the Murray-Darling Basin by adhering to the science on river and water health, beginning with accurate baseline allocations with quantification of diversions and extractions. Instate a national water ombudsman with federal jurisdiction with power to protect low flows and environmental watering events automatically trigger embargoes. Unwind the 2012 amendments to the Barwon-Darling Water Resource Plan that were not publicly assessed, i.e. rules which increased legal pump sizes, removed daily extraction limits and allowed for more storages. Instate real-time public reporting on all water movement, rainfall, flow, extraction, anomalies, storage, groundwater capacity and fluctuations. Enforce end-of-system targets and other identifiable flow requirements to maintain healthy river ecologies. Standardise licence types, regulatory principles and terminology across the country to actively promote environmental recovery. Immediate upstream embargoes enforced when water quality alerts are issued. Reinstate funding of native fish strategy to restore native fish levels to 60% of pre-European settlement levels by 2050. Currently only 10%, we're at 10% of pre-European levels, so it's quite disastrous. Just on that note too, there's always been talk of, the Darling from Wentworth to Menindee being a full national park. Go the whole hog, put some pride in what we've got, be angry about what's happened over the last 10 years and elevate that to an icon status for the whole country to get behind and say, look at this amazing river that's unlike any other in the world. Immediate, open and transparent presentation and discussion around the effect on river flows of floodplain harvesting to enable meaningful assessment of the proposed infrastructure projects, modelling used to underpin decision making and suitable levels of take. So yeah, thank you.
You've covered a lot of information there, and if you do have, you've mentioned you've had other submissions and we would love any other further information. My question to you is perhaps a combination of the questions I've asked so far this morning. Firstly, do you feel that the kind of economic transition that might have to happen in the region is something that local people would be interested in order to kind of build a long-term regenerative future? I guess my other question is, what kind of actions do you think need to be taken to slow down the industrial scale take of water? They're two different ones, but they're both about the economy. I mean, as a previous speaker said, people say the water issues are complex. They're not. It's actually very simple. The solutions are actually very simple, but it's the economic issues around that and having a kind and compassionate transition perhaps for some local communities so they can continue to live here, but perhaps adjust to the water issues as a reality. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there are already things in place that could happen in regard to transitioning those economies. The local anglers group from New South Wales and Victoria work very hard to suggest that, well, it's millions of dollars that they add to the economies of their states, whether it's sea angling or in the river. So that's a good start, and I believe sometimes you make more money out of tourism than you do out of agriculture. So there are things in place. I think to me is the more complex and difficult thing to debate is the political argument on the ground. somehow environmental water gets blamed for water leaving Shepparton because milk isn't competitive and it'll make more money out of almonds in our region. So there's a point of education that we need to consider in how our economies are changing, what used to be efficient and used to make money in an agricultural sense. But at the base of that, it's like the Water Act. What's the environmental level of sustainable take that is the premise of everything? It's the water in the river first. But you're right, it's a big chore to get people to look at these. They are complex questions because it's the results. It's how people come to that decision to think, why does the river not have water in it? Why are we not making money like we used to? Why can't we have this water pumped to point A, B or C? A healthy working river is essential to any thriving economy. The fresh fruit industry in Menindee is a perfect example of that. Once the water was gone, it disappeared too. So, yeah.
And the second question is more about the larger industrial-scale take of water.
To me, that's a straight political power play. The Country Party once represented country people. I think the National Party's been corporatised. They have bigger fish to fry, and they're very happy to, worry about lobbyists and effective being political rather than coming out and having a look at the rivers and seeing what the results of their actions to support mining and industrial agriculture instead of smaller farms. I think that's going to continue to happen, and that reflects back on what sort of strength you have in your government as a regulatory body. There's the phrase, it was an Italian futurist, I can't remember his name, says, government is the shadow that big business throws. And that really, I think that's a great indication of how things have changed in rural Australia, where the representation of people has kind of been put away for the pursuit of money. And in a lot of ways, it needs to be people over profits. How do we have that deep analysis of how we fit politically when things have changed politically? But yeah, it's about having the discussion like we're having here and asking the big questions of your representatives.
Are there any other questions? I have one more, particularly because you're involved with the council. Has there been much work done on an economic analysis of what a healthy river can actually mean and how you push back at the unwanted structures right now? Like, economics is nearly always working against local communities because larger interests can get the economies of scale in the current flawed economic system to argue this is good for the national economy. Has there been much economic analysis done on what small-scale, local, diverse economies with a healthy river can look like?
I think with the Mildura Rural City Council presenting to the Royal Commission, that sort of started, not quite in the area that you've said, but we're beginning to look at why and how. Obviously there's only, a variable amount of water in a low intake year or a high intake year that comes into the system. What we should or shouldn't expand on is very, very important. So we are beginning to think about that, but sometimes I think councils are just really focusing on their roads, rates and rubbish and, wondering why they only collect 3% of the tax but present 35% of the services. So there's other issues there as well. But no, they're not, but I think it's something that could be pushed. The other interesting thing before I go is I think there's 50% more development from Swan Hill to the border than there was in the millennial drought. And through the millennial drought, a lot of the farmers for a couple of years only got 30% of their allocation. And on top of all those almonds and other development around, when the next drought kicks in, which is quite possibly next year, there will be some pain in this region. And I think that's reflecting back on what you've said. How do you make resilient economies with resilient communities that understand the importance of their natural resources outside of those larger political that political dynamism between capital and representation?
No, thank you. And the reason I ask is because in today's paradigm where money talks, I'm more interested in respecting the river as a sacred entity, but I'm aware that the realities are, if as communities we can build an argument that the economies are stronger as well when the healthy rivers are functioning, then you've got a very powerful story to tell the people who are making the wrong decisions.
Yeah, I think what is interesting is how previously publicly owned entities or natural monopolies have been, local government entities are now modelled on a corporate entity, and sometimes that's about protecting the entity rather than looking deeply at the benefit you're gaining from the natural environment around you. We've had a couple of blue-green algal outbreaks, one in 2016 and one this year, that already suggests that there's great pressure on the Murray already, and if you match that with the massive algal blooms in 91 on the Darling, I think, you're starting to get these parameters between the smaller, less volumed of water river in the Darling and then what's happening on the Murray. Just one other fact, sorry, have I still got time? I'll keep going in my rambling way. Okay, so I went upriver with a heap of hydrologists and fish doctors a couple of years ago, and we stood at the Wentworth Weir, and I think it was 8,000 gigs a day that were going over the weir at Wentworth, which is pretty big. And at the end of 2016, there was a flood, the first flood in ages. And I think at that period, at the height of the flood, there was like 110,000 gigs going past a day. But in 1956, the water going through where the weir was 360,000 gigs a day. So when you talk about the entity that is the Murray-Darling Basin and the ephemeral nature of the rivers, I don't think people really understand the reach that it had and the places that water went and the ecologies, I don't like using the word, the ecologies it touched, not serviced. Let's go away from the capital. So there is a... there is a complexity in the basin, of course, but there's a simplicity in understanding that it's been changed that dramatically that we really don't know the effect we're having on it, particularly with those numbers, because they're really dramatic volumes. Not that it'd be a 360,000 gig, that's a 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 megs, megs, not gigs. That's be even bigger. So that's that idea of how much we've changed the river, how important it is to look at all the scientific evidence to try and bring the river to a healthy level with sustainable farming and agriculture overlaid on those numbers.